Live in Bozeman. I think we have people from all over the state here. So I live here. I've been here about 8 years. I came to Bozeman through a job with Right Now Technologies, and I joined Right Now Technologies as a product manager focused on our platform strategy, integration, APIs, things like that. Prior to that, I worked as a developer down in Boulder, and recently have left what is now Oracle and kind of pursuing entrepreneurial activities and doing a lot more development, which led me to learn about Code Deploy, and thought I'd share that with you today. But I loved Jeff Trom's introduction, keynote, both from the product management background and from the development side. So as a product manager, I love the kill off your products that people aren't using. That was like a big thing I wanted to do. So I loved hearing that. And from the development side, I loved hearing, get your stuff into production, get people using it, getting that continuous deployment model. And we use Code Deploy to do that. It's just one tool, and hopefully you can use it in some of your projects. So we'll go ahead and get started. I do set goals for myself, and so I had to come up with goals of this session. And my goal is to help you as you're trying to deploy to production, whether that's a large enterprise application or even just a side project. And so what I want to do when you're deploying to production is take you from being this guy who's like getting ready to do the big swap, and you don't really know how it's going to go, right? And if it doesn't go good, you're going to be running for your life, hair on fire. And so let's go from that guy to being like this guy, where we're smooth, we're confident, there's not a care in the world, and that is not me, by the way, in case you were wondering, but that's our goal for this session. So I hope to be able to help you make this transition when you're deploying to production. I am going to be making some assumptions in the presentation. There's a lot of stuff you have to have with Amazon Web Services and a lot of sort of knowledge around AWS. I don't have time to cover it all today. So as I go through this, I will try to touch on some things that I'm using from AWS that aren't related to Code Deploy necessarily. Things like IAM, EC2 instances, auto-scaling, ELBs. If you don't know about this stuff, it's okay, you can go learn. I'll talk about it as I go through, as I said, but there is some assumptions built into the presentation about sort of a basic knowledge of AWS concepts. So why do we have Code Deploy? What problem is it trying to solve? Anytime you're running an application, especially like a large enterprise application that you might be selling, you're generally going to have a few different environments. You might have a test environment, you might have a staging environment, a production environment, maybe even production plus one, where you're running some beta features. And anytime you want to do a new deployment of your application to any one of these environments, there's kind of a lot of work you have to do, right? You have to somehow get your application, the new source code, everything out to the server. You might have to deregister that server instance from load balancers. You might have to stop the web servers you're using. You might have to update your database. You might have to move some files around. There's just a lot of work that might have to be done when you're doing these deployments. And depending on how you've architected your application, you might have multiple servers running that support your application. Those servers might be running different tiers of your application, so maybe a web tier, an API tier, a data tier, utility servers. And depending on what you're deploying where, you're going to have to potentially have different deployment steps. And so this problem just sort of compounds, and as your application grows and you have more servers, more environments, it gets harder and harder. And so inevitably what ends up happening is you'll put some infrastructure in place to help you do these deployments. That ends up being a lot of work. You got to support that. And what AWS Code Deploy does is try to remove all of that work for you and give you an automated way to do this. So that's the problem Code Deploy is setting out to solve. Basically, it's a service from Amazon that allows you to coordinate your application deployments out across any instance that you have, any EC2 instance. I have this picture of this Greek god. Anyone know who that is by chance? Okay, me neither. It's Apollo. And the significance of that is, like everything else with AWS, Code Deploy was an internal service that Amazon built and used themselves. It was known as Apollo internally. And recently, maybe a year or two back, they opened it up for everyone to use, and they called it AWS Code Deploy. So that's where it comes from. Just to talk about some of the features, first thing, as I mentioned, it allows you to automate your deployments across any instance, and I'll show you how we do that through a demo in a little bit. Then it also gives you the ability to do rolling updates. So you don't have to update everything at once. You can sort of roll these out to your fleet of servers through what's known as a deployment configuration. And I'll show you the different deployment configurations that they have. They don't have an automated rollback capability in code deploy, so if your deployment fails, you can't just like automatically roll back, but using the capabilities of code deploy, you can simulate a rollback, and you can stop a deployment at any time that it's active. So if you go to deploy a new version and you're like, oh man, I forgot I needed this file in my application revision, you can stop the deployment, update your application, then start a new deployment. They have a lot of tools to track your deployments. This becomes important when you have a lot of servers and different environments out there. So I'll show you this through the AWS Code Deploy Console, but also they, like everything, they have great command line tools, log files that you can watch so you can really understand what's going on with your deployments. And then for me, being kind of a platform API guy, what's really cool about Code Deploy is that it's 100% agnostic to your application, the technology you're using. You can have a Node.js app, you can have a Java Play app, you can have Ruby on Rails, and Code Deploy doesn't care. And it doesn't really care what other services you're running. It can work with anything, and that's what's really neat for me about it and what kind of drew me into it. So those are just some of the features. There's a lot more, but these are some of the big ones. And what I'll do now is actually walk you through the different components that you have to have configured and use in Code Deploy, and then we'll go into a demo, and hopefully everything works well, and we can go through some deployments of an application. So with Code Deploy, there's three things that you need to basically set up or be aware of when you're going to do a deployment. First is what to deploy, and this is going to be your application, right? And in Code Deploy speak, they call these application revisions. Basically, it's an archive. I'll tell you what's in that archive in just a moment, but that's what we're going to deploy. The second thing then is how we're going to deploy it. This is what's going to be called your deployment configuration. They have three options for how you can deploy your application, which we'll walk through in just a moment. And then lastly is where to deploy. So Code Deploy works against any EC2 instance. These are essentially the Amazon servers. If you haven't used EC2, it's just like a server you could set up. And you can deploy to any EC2 instance. The way you do that is by specifying either a tag that you apply to the instance. So if you named all your EC2 instances with a tag equal to test, name equals test for your test servers, then you could say, I want to deploy to all EC2 instances that are tagged test. The other way you can deploy is through an auto-scaling group. So if you're using auto-scaling, which basically just lets AWS scale up and down new servers for you based on criteria you define, Code Deploy will deploy revisions to an auto-scaling group that you specify. The other thing I'd highlight is that Code Deploy does work with on-premise instances. I don't do anything on-premise anymore, so I can't help you with that. I have no idea how it works, but I do know they do support deploying to on-premise systems. If you have that, you need to look into that. The other thing is, if you're going to use Code Deploy, on all your EC2 instances, you need to have the Code Deploy agent installed. And I'm not going to do that in the demo. It's just some pre-setup work I did. It's like 3 Linux commands you can run on your EC2 instance, and it will set up the agent for you. It's very easy. So let me walk you through each of these components in a little bit more detail. The first is the application revision. And you guys cannot see the Sublime file there, but I'll walk you through it anyways. The application revision has 3 components in it. Basically, it's an archive, a zip file that you're going to put together. And in that archive, you're going to have first the source for your application, whatever makes up your application. This is your compiled binaries, it's your markup, it's your JavaScript, your CSS, whatever you have. That goes into the archive. The second thing that's going to go in there are your deployment scripts. These are shell scripts that you write that run at different points along the deployment lifecycle. And I'll talk about these, they're essentially called hooks in just a moment, but you have a hook when the application stops, when they go to install the application, after the install completes, and these are points where you can run these scripts, but the scripts have to be contained in this archive file. And then lastly is this app spec file, and I apologize, you guys can't read it, or maybe you can, it's a little bigger on this one. But the app spec file is a YAML formatted file that tells code deploy basically how to deploy your application. And there's 3 sections to this app spec file. The first are these 2 lines at the top. One is version and one is the OS. The version has to be set to 0.0. So this took me like 4 hours of my life to figure out because I had thought it was the version of my application, so I had 1.0 in there. And I'm not very good at reading documentation. Had I read the documentation, which is in the link here, I would have known that this is a reserved field and it has to be set to 0.0. So I saved you all 4 hours. If you do this, just set it to 0.0. The second field is the OS. This is another reserved field. It has to be Linux or Windows based on the type of EC2 instance you have. So those are what they are. The second section is a file section. And the file section basically just tells code deploy where your application files are in the archive. So you give it a directory, all my files are in /www. And then when it deploys it, where it should put those files on the server. In this case, they go to home Ubuntu www. And if you need to change permissions on these files, you can set that here as well. And then lastly, there's this hook section where you can tell code deploy when the application stop hook runs, run my script stop web server. And that script, again, is going to be in the archive in your deployment scripts. So this is what goes into that application revision file. The next is our deployment configuration. So once you create the application archive, you're going to put that in one of 3 locations for code deploy. It can either live in an S3 bucket, it can live on GitHub, or recently they did add support for Bitbucket, but that was very recently. So I think I'm using S3, but you can do this with GitHub if you want to get a little more fancy there. So you have your application archived on one of those locations. The next thing you have to do is tell code deploy the configuration you want to use. And there's 3 options when you do an update or a code deploy. The first is 1 at a time, then we have half at a time, and all at once. And this basically just tells code deploy, if you have multiple servers out there running in your deployment group, how it should deploy that application. So 1 at a time is what you would expect. If we're deploying to all the instances that have a tag of test, it'll run the deployment on the first instance. Once that deployment succeeds, it'll then run on the next instance. So this allows you to keep one server up while one server is being updated. And that way you can keep users using your application. If you were deploying to an auto-scaling group, or even if you were just using the tags and you did half at a time, it does what you would expect. If we had 4 running servers, 2 of those would be updated at once, and then once those complete, they would deploy to the next 2 servers. That's what half at a time does. All at once, everything goes at one time. So you have that deployment option. Now the other cool thing about code deploy and this service is that if you're using EC2 auto-scaling groups and you have new instances that come up in that auto-scaling group, so I have these 2 faded out boxes. Imagine, my system comes under load and that I want to spin these systems up. As those new EC2 instances come online, the code deploy service is automatically going to run. It's going to pull down the latest application revision that I have deployed to the other running instances, and it's going to deploy that. So now I don't have to bake my application into the AMIs. Just as these instances come online, they're automatically going to reach out to either S3, GitHub, or Bitbucket, get my latest application, deploy it, and run it. And so this is pretty nice. One thing I would just tell you, if you go this route with auto-scaling and you're using code deploy, make sure that you always deploy your latest version to the auto-scaling group, because if you were to put a new application revision out on S3 and you don't deploy it, when auto-scaling runs, code deploy is going to reach out, it's going to grab like version 2 of your app, and it's going to say, hey, I got this new file, but I expected version 1. And it's not going to be able to run the deployment, and your auto-scaling is going to fail, and EC2 instances will be shut down, and then they'll try to come up again, code deploy will try to run, it'll fail, and it happens so fast you can't even get to your EC2 instances. So just make sure that you always deploy to your auto-scaling group if you put a new version of your application out there. Yeah, Eric?
If you do the all at once, is that
It would if your application behaves that way. So like if you shut down your web server when you do a deployment, which I do, it would take all of those down at once. So yeah, we use the one at a time or half at a time, and then basically, as I'll show you in the demo, when I stop the web servers, I deregister from the load balancer, and you'd want to like bleed out sticky sessions or whatever. But so traffic goes to like version 1 while this server's getting version 2, then it comes online, all the traffic goes there while that other instance comes down. And so that allows us to do new deployments without having any downtime. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so we have an application revision. We set up our deployment configuration and deployment group, so how we want to deploy and where we're going to deploy. Now basically what happens when we do the deployment. So the first thing is we have to start a deployment. And there's 3 ways that you can start a code deployment using this service. The first is you can use the code deploy console in AWS. That's what I'm going to do for the demo, so you can see that. They do have a set of command line tools that you can use and an SDK. So this is really great if you want to go crazy and like automate this with Jenkins or your build process or whatever. Or, as I just mentioned, auto-scaling can kick off a code deployment. The first thing that's going to happen after you start a deployment is they're going to fire a hook that you can plug into and run a custom shell script. And this is an application stop hook. Now, one thing to be aware of, this again cost me 4 hours on Sunday, is I can't find this documented anywhere, but apparently the application stop hook will not run the very first time you do a new deployment for an application. So I'll show you that in the demo, but after you've done one deployment, then this hook will run. After application stop happens, the code deploy service is going to download your application from wherever you specify. That can be GitHub, S3, or Bitbucket. And then it's going to fire another hook that you can tie into, which is before installation hook. Just another opportunity for you to run more scripts to do whatever you need to do. Then it's going to install. So the installation, it's going to look in your app-spec YAML file, it's going to see that file section, and it's going to copy the files that you've specified in there, set the permissions, and that's what basically happens during the install process. Then we have another hook, which is after install. So once your files are in place, you can tell the code deploy to run a script if you want. Then we have an application start hook, and lastly, a validation hook that you can run. And after all of those complete successfully, the code deployment ends. And if you had like one at a time as your deployment option, it would go to the next server and repeat this life cycle. So that's the quick introduction to how code deploy works and the components we need. Now I'll kind of switch and walk you through some demos. But before I do that, I just want to talk about the setup I did, because there is kind of a lot going on here. We need an application, we need EC2 instances, etc. So I have a couple EC2 instances running. They have Node.js running as a service. They're Ubuntu instances. And I have a very simple Node app that I'll show you that's running. I also have installed, as I mentioned, the code deploy agent on these EC2 instances. So that work has been done. It's very simple. There's a link here to go read the installation docs. It's literally like 3 commands that you run. You download a file and just run an install script. And then I've also set up the AWS command line tools and configured those. Now, one of the hardest parts for me as I was trying to use code deploy was I was also learning a little bit about AWS at the same time. And if you've ever used AWS, at least for me, the documentation's a bit overwhelming. Like every 3rd word is a link to something else on AWS that I have to learn. And so the hardest part for me was just the IAM setup. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about this to maybe save someone a bit of time. With code deploy, there's 3 essentially roles you have to set up in identity access management on AWS. The first is a user role, and this user role is for us, the people that use AWS web services. And if you log into AWS, you have a user account. And if you want to be able to use code deploy, or you want users that you provision use code deploy, they have to have code access basically to code deploy. So you can give them this code deploy starter policy in their profile. But that's what a user role is. The second thing you have to create is a service role. And what a service role is in AWS is it just lets Amazon's services call basically other services. And you're going to want to go into IAM, you can create a service role, and in there they have a predefined code deploy role that you will specify, and that's basically the service role. And you're going to see how we use that when we do a deployment. And then lastly is you have to have an instance role on your EC2 instances. And this grants, what an instance role does is it basically gives that EC2 instance permissions to do things. The trick here is once you've started an EC2 instance, you can't assign it a role. So before you start an instance, just save yourself a little bit of time, go create an instance role, even if it's empty. Like you don't have to put any permissions in there. Then you can assign it to your EC2 instances before you launch them, and then later on you can go and adjust the permissions. So it's just a little bit of a time saver. All right, it is finally demo time. I always get excited, like Steve Ballmer for demos. No one thinks that's funny? I think Steve Ballmer jumping around is funny. All right, so let me switch over and walk you through the demo, and hopefully you guys can see the screen okay. So as I mentioned, I just have 2 EC2 instances running. Can you guys see this okay, or should I zoom in? Is it?
It's good.
It's good? All right, thank you. So I have 2 EC2 instances running, and I have these registered with a load balancer. So basically, if you look here, those 2 EC2 instances are registered with the load balancer. Again, they're running Node.js, and what I'm doing is basically I have open here. Let's close these down. Whoops. I have open here. Oh, I just killed all of my Chrome windows. That's all right. So I have, this is my Node app that's being sent through the load balancer, and then I have a few terminal windows here that are just logging events as I hit the Node servers. So basically you can see some logs for the health checks from the ELV, and as I refresh this page, you're just going to see requests going to one or the other server. So that's just the setup there. Let me re-log into AWS. Apologize about that. Okay, so then we have, I'll just show you my Node app. Basically very simple for demo purposes. I just have 2 routes defined. One is the index route, and it serves up an index.jade file, which is very basic. Just says Big Sky DevCon, and this is an awesome app. Then what I did was I created a very simple build script, and the build script just creates that application revision archive that I need. What this build script does is it copies the www directory, and it copies my scripts directory, and basically makes a tarball of that stuff. So it has my application source files, and then it has the scripts that I want to run when we do the deployment. The other thing it does is it pulls in my app spec YAML file. So this is the application spec file. Again, very simple. These are the 2 reserved fields, version and OS. I then have, in the archive, I have a www directory that has my application. I copy that to home Ubuntu www, and this is where my Node.js service points when it starts up. And then I basically just listen to 3 hooks: the stop, the before install, and the application start. So what my stop web server script does is it's pretty simple. It gets the instance ID for the EC2 instance. It then calls the AWS command to deregister from the load balancer. I sleep for 30 seconds just so that I can show you some log files and things, and we have time to click around. And then it basically stops the node service. Start web server is just the inverse. It's going to, it runs npm install, even though I don't like installing packages in the demo, but this just shows you like this is where you can load up new packages or do whatever you need to do. We then sleep for 30 seconds. I start up the web server, and then I register with the ELB. So this will bring that server back online. All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll create a new version of our application. So I'll set it to version 2, and we'll just add an image to this. And then we will run the build script. And basically, again, the build script is just creating this directory and this archive file that has the www directory, the scripts directory, and my app spec YAML file. So then what we're going to do is come back to Amazon, and I'm going to upload this into my Big Sky DevCon directory. And while that is loading, I am going to open up the code deploy console. So we'll go ahead and upload our latest revision here to S3, and we'll start that upload. And then I'm just going to grab the URL of this, and you'll see why this is important in a minute. So then within code deploy, or excuse me, within Amazon, if you go under services, you'll find this code deploy link. And the first time you go to that, you're going to get their getting started page. And there's like a tutorial walkthrough that you can do. They have a sample application if you need to do that. In our case, we're going to skip that, and we're just going to go to a custom deployment. So the first thing you do is you create an application. So for like us, we have a web tier, API tier, data tier. So I have 3 applications, one for each of those. In this example, we'll just name our application Big Sky DevCon. And once you create an application, it's kind of a one-time thing. After you have the application defined, you just do deployments for that application. But initial setup, you create this. And then here is where you're going to specify your deployment group. And you can see we have 3 options. EC2, we have auto scaling, and then on-premise instances. So to start, we're just going to start with Amazon EC2. And then basically, it'll pull in your keys that you've defined for tags. And in this case, I just have my instances tagged with Big Sky DevCon. And then the kind of nice thing is they show you how many instances this deployment would affect. This is where you can set a deployment configuration. We'll do one at a time. And then this is where you're going to set that service role that I talked about from IAM. So you have to basically give code deploy these permissions. So I'll go ahead and create the application. And once that's done, basically the application will show up here. And if you want to do a deployment, you just use this menu, select deployment, and we'll go ahead and create a new deployment. And from the dropdown, then you can select the applications that you have defined. So we'll select Big Sky DevCon. It'll then give you an option to select the deployment groups that you have defined for that application. So you could define multiple different deployment groups. We just have the one, so we'll do the Big Sky DevCon. And then here are the options for Amazon S3 and GitHub. I don't see Bitbucket listed here, but I did find it in the documentation. So like I said, I'm not using Bitbucket, I just use S3. And then you just paste in the URL from S3 for your application archive. It automatically detects the file type, and we can say, you know, our first deployment. So I'll go ahead and deploy this. A lot of things happen when we do a deployment, too much for me to show you in one deployment. So we'll just do a deployment, we'll watch kind of what happens in the console, we'll see our application get updated, and then we'll do a second deployment, and I'll show you some log files and how you can monitor what's going on the actual servers. So if you remember, this is our application, just version 1. We'll go ahead and deploy now. And basically, it kicks off the deployment. And this is a great spot where you could come and sort of see what's going on with your deployments, especially if it takes some time. So you can, it will auto-refresh, but you can also just refresh here, and you can see it started 14 seconds ago, and it's in progress. And in just a few seconds, what will happen is basically, oh, excuse me, I got to click in one more time. Go down to the deployment. You can basically see, it was a little slow, but it starts to show you all the events that it's run, and you can click into here and see where it is in your application deployment lifecycle, and then how long everything took. So the application stopped, you can see it went in 1 second. even though my script had that 30-second sleep in there. That's because I'm pretty confident after hours of playing with this that the very first deployment, they don't run application stop. The next deployment we do, we'll see that take 30 seconds. So we can refresh this. You can see that succeeded, and if we go back to our deployment, now you can see it's onto the second instance, and it's actually deploying out into that instance. We can look at the events, and basically we're just waiting now for the application to start, which has that 30-second sleep in there. So if we go ahead and wait a couple more seconds, hopefully this will tick over and we will see the application start. Yeah, so application started, and now if we refresh, we have version 2 of our application running, which now has an image. So let me do a new deployment now, and we'll actually watch the log files on the servers so you can see things deregister from the ELB, and then I'll refresh the app a little bit more in real time, and we can watch the logs and see how traffic goes to one server while the other server gets updated. So to do that, I'll just go back and we'll change this to version 3, and we'll just remove our image. And then I will just remove my build directory and run a new build. And then we will upload that again to S3. So I'll grab this file, put it on S3. And I'm going to grab the URL again, even though the file name is the same. And this is very important. This is another multi-hour time saver for you. When you go to do a deployment, even if you name the application revision the same, you might just think, well, I can use this dropdown and my file is named the same and I don't have to copy and paste it. The thing is, code deploy tacks on this little etag query program, and if you try to reuse this, it'll fail. So just always grab the URL from S3 and paste that in, and don't rely on the dropdown. Okay, so this time what we'll do is over in our terminal windows, I will, rather than tail both servers' node logs, one of them I'll tail the deployment log. So if you use code deploy, you'll find it installed under /op, code deploy agent, and then there is a deployment root directory, and within there, a deployment logs directory. And there you will find the code deploy agent log. So just a good directory to be aware of. It is in the documentation. So I'll clear that, we'll clear this, and we will do a new deployment. So we'll kick this off, and what we should see is the deployment start to run. So basically my application stop event fired. You can see this is basically the log saying it's going to deregister from the ELB. And if I go back to my management console, and hopefully I can beat the clock here, we go to load balancers, and we look at instances. There's just one instance in service. So we're deploying to one, we deregister it from the ELB, and if I refresh our app, I'm still on version 2, but all the requests are going to this server. While in the background, you can see this server is running the code deploy scripts and deploying. And now basically 30 seconds will pass. This instance should start up node, it should register with the ELB, and then this instance will come offline, and all of our traffic will start going to version 3 of our application. So we'll just give this a second to run. So kind of a lot going on. Is this making sense so far? Seen a few nods? Okay, good. It's funny, you put a 30-second sleep in and you feel like it's not a lot of time, but then when you're up here talking, like 30 seconds is eternity. All right, so basically it has re-registered with the ELB. If I come back over here and we refresh this, let me show you the logs here. Basically, the ELB's got to run 2 health checks. Those are the health checks after we started the server. So if we refresh, that server instance looks like it's back registered, and if we refresh here, we're now on version 3 of our application. The image is gone, and now this guy should be running the code deploy. So we'll go to deployment root and deployment logs. Slide that up so you guys can see it. And it is. It's basically waiting to start the web server. And if you were to go back to the management console and actually click on your deployment ID, you can see here that it's basically running the scripts. And this time, you'll notice that it did take 30 seconds to run the application stop. So that's something to be aware of, that your very first time, don't expect your application stop hooks to run. The other thing I just want to highlight here is that, let's say you were doing a deployment and your application stopped and then it went to download the bundle and you had mistyped the URL. Your deployment's going to fail because it can't find that bundle. Because Code Deploy doesn't have automatic rollback, your application is essentially stopped on that server. So if you went and fixed your URL and you go to run Code Deploy again, it's going to try to run your application stop script. And it's smart enough to look at the return codes of what your script does. So if you try to stop a service that's already stopped, that counts as an error. And Code Deploy won't run. It's going to say, hey, application stop failed, and it won't run. So you either have to go back onto your server and basically start up your app server again so that your application stop script will run, or you can kick off the Code Deploy from the command line where you can give it an option to ignore application stop failures. So that's just another little trick to be aware of. If you're using the console, I don't believe they have an option, at least I haven't seen it, where you can say ignore application stop failures. So you might just want to use the command line for that. So I would expect by now, hopefully this server is back online. It looks like it is. We're getting health checks. And if we refresh our app, basically both servers are getting requests again, and they're both serving version 3 of our application. So now what I will do quickly is go back to EC2, and I'm just going to stop these instances. So I'll stop those, and I have a auto-scaling group set up, and I'm just going to create have auto-scaling set up a desired of 1, and a minimum of 1 server. And we'll go ahead and save this. And so basically, what I expect to happen here in just a few seconds is that these servers are just shutting down. Those were the ones that were tagged with EC2 names. Now I'll show you a deployment with auto-scaling. Works much the same way, but we'll actually change the auto-scaling config once we've done a deployment, so you can see that Code Deploy will automatically run when auto-scaling fires. So hopefully, here's our new server coming online, and while that's running, I'm just going to create a new application. So we'll call this Big Sky DevCon Auto Scaling. And give this guy a second here. Okay, so that server is now up. If we go back to Code Deploy, now instead of selecting an EC2 instance, I can select an auto scaling group. And I have this Big Sky DevCon Auto Scaling group with just 1 instance. And we'll assign our service role, create that application, and then just going to grab this URL, and we will do a new deployment for this application. So I'll select auto-scaling application in my auto-scaling group, and we'll go ahead and deploy this. Okay, so that should just run here in a few seconds. Now, once the application, the latest version of the application is deployed to auto-scaling, then what we'll do is simulate auto-scaling, bringing up new servers, and you'll see a deployment automatically run. And just check the status of this guy. Yeah, so it's going pretty quick, as we would expect, just this 30 seconds to start. While we're just waiting for that to finish, any questions so far? No questions? Maybe? Yeah, go ahead.
How do you manage your environment variables and the secrets that you need in production? Do you bake those into the AMIs generally, or do you manage that with code deploy?
So it's gonna, I mean, code deploy won't know anything about your secrets, keys, and all that. So however you manage those, you can do. You just have to tell your scripts basically like how you get that key and what config you need to update for those keys. So like if you bake into your AMI, some way to get that key, that's fine. You can just put in your script like, hey, run this script that will go get my key or shared secret or whatever, and then update your web config files or whatever that you do with that key. But there's nothing in code deploy that will know anything about your shared secrets or keys. Does that make sense? Yep. Okay, so with this running now, what we'll do is we'll go back to EC2 and we'll go to our auto scaling group. And instead of just running one instance, I will up this from 1 instance to 2. And we'll just kind of watch our code deploy console. And in a few seconds here, we should see a new code deploy automatically start because a new EC2 instance is booting up in that auto scaling group. So, yeah, Eric?
How do you secure the connection to get the app?
The application archive?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the S3 buckets are locked down unless you give people permission to them. And so what you need to do is basically give your EC2 instance role permissions to be able to access that that S3 bucket. Sorry if I didn't repeat the question. It was, how do you secure your application revision? And in my case, using S3, I have it in a lockdown bucket that only I have access to and my EC2 instances have access to. If you're using GitHub or something else, like one place I'd like to get to is where I commit to get all my tests run, it automatically runs the build, there's this new application revision, and ideally that would just deploy if all your tests pass. But in reality, you probably, at least me, I want someone to kind of look at it right now. But I'd love it if then the product manager or the QA person could say, yeah, this is good, click a button, and that button triggers the deployment automatically. And now I don't have to worry about it. But yeah, you just lock the bucket down. So yeah, here you can see the new deployment kicked off because that new auto scaling instance came online and starts running. So that is the demo. Another couple other things to know that I thought were important. Some of these I talked about on the way, but there's no cost for code deploy. It is a free service from Amazon. So yeah, just start using it. Like I said, even if you're not running an enterprise app with multiple servers and different environments, just even for your side projects, it's really good to get in this habit, as Jeff mentioned, of just pushing to production, going through those motions, making sure you can do that work. Code deploy is not in all regions today, so just these are the main ones it's in, but if you're using some crazy region, you might want to check if you're planning to use code deploy. I talked about where the log files were and some of this other stuff around auto scaling and being careful about application stop failures. The other thing I just want to talk about is if you use auto scaling and you use code deploy, do not bake code deploy agent into your EC2 instance AMIs. So the reason you don't want to do this is code deploy is an application that Amazon is going to update from time to time, and you need to make sure that you have the latest version of the code deploy agent running so that it can work with the code deploy service. So the way to do this is rather than install the code deploy agent on your AMI, just write a little script that when the instance boots up, it runs that script. That script runs the commands to install the code deploy agent. And I have the script actually made if you want it. I'd be happy to share it. Nothing too crazy there though. So yeah, this is just an introduction. There's a lot more, as I just mentioned. You can get as crazy as you want automating this in your build process and really turning deployment over to QA or your product manager or whoever says this is good to go, which I think is really cool because we want to get back to just writing software and let someone else do the deployment when they're ready. Thank you again for attending the session. One of my own goals, beyond helping you go from the Indiana Jones guy to the slip and slide guy, is I'm hoping to meet some new people at the conference. So please come introduce yourself. I'd love to meet you. I met a couple of people at the barbecue. I actually met the do-it-yourself Pete guy this morning. If anyone has seen those YouTube things, they're awesome. I haven't done any of the projects, but he's here. So yeah, please come introduce yourself, and then I can answer any more questions. Yeah. So you register from the ELB. Basically, Amazon command line tools give you basically this command. So you call AWS ELB and then deregister instance from load balancer, and then you give it the name of the load balancer and your instance ID that you want to deregister. And so that's how I do that. Other questions? Is this helpful? Anyone planning to use code deploy after this? No? All right, one in the back. Rob is going to. Well, thank you. I'll stick around if you have other questions. I'll be up here. Otherwise, I think it's about when we're supposed to end.